Well, good morning. I'd forgotten about that trip. I'm pleased to remember it because I'd forgotten about it. It was a pleasure to take you, Brett, and thanks for what you've done since you've arrived in the Hunter. I'd firstly like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands of the Hunter, elders past, present and emerging, and I'll come back to some matters associated with Indigenous ownership a bit later on. I also thank Local Land Services for convening this event and also for inviting me to speak. I'm going to talk about the past and present and also focus on the future. I think it's an ideal opportunity to do that, and I was delighted that the focus of today is on improving the health and resilience of the Hunter River through community engagement and riparian management. So my talk will be about the riparian zone only, and mainly in the greater Hunter River rather than the sort of every tributary, but I know every tributary is important, of course. I'll just go back to the 1946 flood, which smashed the Hunter. The Hunter had been covered with rabbits and drought for the years 1935 to 1946. Enormous flood, it really smashed it. And there's a committee of inquiry set up by the state government, and they gave a report which led to the formation of the Hunter Valley Conservation Trust Act, which passed in New South Wales Parliament in October 1950. And I acknowledge the great work and role and dedicated work of people who worked for the Trust over the past 73 years. I've always admired the Trust, and I was fortunate to be at Tocal when there's the opportunity for its offices to be moved to Tocal, and I was pleased that all happened. I arrived in the Hunter in 1975 as a lecturer in agronomy at Tocal. And I just wanted to say a bit about the demographics of the Hunter then compared to now. Dairying started its slow decline, and the smaller farms and the older farmers started to cease. Beef was the only alternative, and then it just crashed, so things were pretty grim. Small farms have to use every square inch of their land, and I'll come back to that, to remain viable, and this is before there's a lot of off-farm income and off-farm income opportunities. And then the idea of active conservation on farms was not common. There were a few enthusiasts, but not many. The upper Hunter's mining and equine industry was small compared to now. But there was a rise of 25-acre blocks, especially in the lower Hunter, where I was, and that's when you could cut land up in the 25-acre blocks, and the baby boomers piled in and lived in the bush and on 25-acre blocks. There was little money coming from the city into farming, and that was usually associated with Pitt Street farmers and tax dodging. So that was the sort of mantra if somebody bought a farm in the country that's about dodging tax, but that's all changed. So that were the demographics then. By 1990, land care and the environmental movement had established and was becoming mainstream. It was by no means mainstream by 1990, because I watched that closely, and it was interesting to see how there was pushback for some agencies against land care and daring to let the community have a bit of a go. In 1988 we had a big flood at Tocal, and I fenced off a portion of Riverbank on Glendara at Tocal where I was living, and that was considered a bit out there, but fortunately I got about $1,000 worth of fencing materials from the Hunter Catchment Management Trust through Sharon Vernon, and I was able to do that. But it's considered a bit unusual that you should fence off the riverbank, and some of the colleagues were not particularly happy about that and wanted to put their stock back in there. But once the green cestrum got going, it was safe, because it's full of green cestrum, and anyone who knows about green cestrum will knock animals over quickly, so it saved the bank, and the trees are big now. And by then there was cross-generational enthusiasm for the environment, and actually the word environment was not a word used until the 70s. Conservation, but the word environment as a concept was never used. So what's happened by 2023? Fencing the riparian zone is a well-accepted practice. The mines and the horse studs occupy a considerable portion of the mid-Hunter River and have largely excluded grazing land. So they've fenced off. Just have a look at Google Earth. The mines and the horse studs don't want their staff scrambling around on a riverbank, so they fence it off. That was to stop me, but I'll wait for the bell. I might wait for Brett to sing, actually, but anyway. So that's all right for mine and the horse stud, because you don't need the river in the same way. Excluding grazing on an agricultural property, on a farming property, grazing property is much more difficult. But sooner or later it has to be done, especially in the larger parts of the hunter. And it is tricky with floodgates and fences, all sorts of things, and I know how hard that is. And in the 2015 flood, I just planted a lot of trees on Tocal, all this fencing and stuff. The whole lot disappeared in the flood. It's all gone. So that's the sort of thing that can happen. So now many of the former dairy farms are held by non-traditional farmers, most who have off-farm income, and that many are interested in regenerative agriculture. And the baby boomers are back, but they've got money in their pocket this time and they want to buy a bigger patch of land. And they have different views of how the land will be managed. And if they don't think it's, don't have conservation ideas, their kids or their grandkids will be into them about doing something for the environment and so on. So we've got a whole different demographic in the hunter now than we had 40, 50 years ago, and we have to use that to our advantage. But in 2023, the roles of the former Hunter Valley Conservation Trust are now dispersed in various arms of government, and it's wonderful that Brett have all those arms of government here. And I'm not saying we have to go back to the old days, but we have to look at all those arms of government, which you won't change that's with us. And that's really important, but we have to work with all that complexity. And I was pleased to hear those words from Brett about complexity. And I again acknowledge the great role LLS does, but the LLS cannot publicly advocate for the river. There's no one advocating for the river. LLS is part of New South Wales government and they cannot advocate. They advocate internally but not externally. So we need to advocate for the river, and the riparian zone needs investment. We know what needs to be done, the science is there, the plans are there, and it just needs to be done. When we look around, we see money being spent in other places in the natural environment. We see Swansea Channel being dredged. Stockton Beach receives beach nourishment. 21 million promised in the state election. Newcastle Harbour gets dredged. So there ought to be defined expenditure on the hunter. We just read last week, $200 million to barrier reef catchments. And this is a joint media release from Canberra. The Albanese government today announced an extra $50 million to improve water quality on the barrier reef, bringing our total investment to $200 million for the new landscape repair program. Poor water quality is one of the most significant threats to the healthy reef. Poor quality from runoff, eroded gullies and riverbank flows in the nearby catchment causes high algal growth, higher concentration of pollutants and reduced light. This $200 million investment will support landowners, traditional owners and environmental groups to carry out projects to repair land in reef catchments that stop nearby erosion, support vegetation and manage the impact of grazing. Does that sound familiar? Stop nearby erosion, support revegetation and manage the impact of grazing. Well, it's good enough for that catchment, it's good enough for us here in the Hunter to have that sort of money spent on our river. Just because we don't have the barrier reef out there doesn't mean to say this river's not important, this river doesn't need expenditure. So what do we do in the future? The Hunter's Riparian Zone is what I'm focusing on. If we had a band 20 or 30 metres each side of the river, from the top of the banks out, and it was forested, it would be a ribbon of sequestered carbon. A ribbon of sequestered carbon happening all the time. Can't that be factored into a budget? But at the moment with carbon accounting, we just say we're not going to clear that land, so we account for it as being a contribution to carbon sequestration, which I don't understand that, but that's accountants. I don't understand much things accountants tell me, but that's one that I find fairly difficult. But if we had a strip of trees along that best land, along the riparian zone, we'd be doing a lot for the water catchment, we'd be doing a lot for the river, and we'd be grabbing some carbon dioxide and keeping it without being out there in the atmosphere. So that's what I think we need to think about, the whole context of how we look after the riverbank, and I think carbon sequestration should be part of that. We also need to consider the Indigenous philosophies and our relationship with our beloved river, and we've already heard this morning acknowledgement of country, acknowledgement of Indigenous people's relationship to the land, and we need to bring into our thinking a few more of those thoughts. I also mentioned something about what's happened over in New Zealand. The Maori have successfully seen legislation enacted in the New Zealand Parliament that the Wanganui River has been given personhood status. Just Google Wanganui River and read about that legislation. Now, what does that really mean? I don't really understand what it fully means, but it means that the river is seen as an entity. It's just not the drain, it's just not the river, it's just not something you just drive over, it's something that people care for. If you live in Maitland and just drive across the Melville Ford and look upstream, it's an absolute disgrace. It's an absolute disgrace. It's terrible. You wouldn't take any there to look at how nice the river is, because we're treating it as a drain. So what's important is we give the river the respect it needs, and when we ask a landholder to exclude livestock from the riparian zone, this must be messaged as a request from the river, not from the government. If it's seen as coming from the government, a proportion of landowners will say, well, I'm not going to do what the government tells me, and that's just the way we work, and that's the thinking that's around. So it needs to be messaged differently. It is tricky on farms to fence off watercourses. Tell me about it. But we need to do it, and we need assistance to do it if we're going to make it happen. So our river, it needs an advocate. We need to advocate for it, but it needs to be an advocate. We can't expect people in LLS to do that publicly. It has to be done publicly the other way, just the same as people have advocated for Swansea Channel, advocated for Stockton Beach, advocate for the Great Barrier Reef. So there's a lot of work to do. So to improve the health and resilience of the Hunter River, we need strong engagement and we need to advocate. So I appreciate the opportunity to speak this morning. Today's a day for the river, and I look forward to answering any questions you might have when the time comes. Thanks very much.